can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation. You know, there is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. There's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices. And that time and place is now.
I'm joined by Matthew Peterson, editor-in-chief of Blaze Media, and Representative Chip Roy. Congressman, Biden said that his work merits a second term, all while the White House has denied all of his health declining. So what did you take away from his speech last night?
Well, I think, first of all, the president, by his very demeanor and observable for all to see, we see exactly why he's stepping down. Right? The president isn't all there. He's like struggling to get through a basic interview, a basic statement, I should say, sitting there in the Oval Office with a teleprompter. And, I think it's critically important for people to understand that this is the commander-in-chief of our military, of our armed forces. This is the guy who's got the nuclear codes, right? This is a real problem, and I think that is all caught up to him. The real reason he stayed in the race is because they don't have any confidence in Kamala Harris. That's the real reason he stayed in. It was all political, and everybody knows it. Democrats are only concerned about one thing, winning in November. They're not concerned about who's in the White House and who's actually making the decisions. That's the truth. And as to his record, like his record speaks for itself. It's horrible. That's why he was underwater, not just his mental deficiencies, wide open borders, Americans getting killed, fentanyl pouring in, China getting empowered, endless wars, massive debt, spiraling inflation because of that debt, criminals on the street. I mean, I could just keep going, right? The list is endless. You can't even chalk up anything on the board that you would objectively say is good. So they're struggling because of his record. They're struggling because of his mental incompetency. And now their vice president is not somebody that they can really strongly rally behind. And that's why they were in a box.
Congressman, yeah, I mean, I think it's unbelievable to me as well that he just doubled down on this insane inflammatory rhetoric that you would think we'd be moving away from. But he just doubled down on it, saying this is about, the soul of the republic, what kind of form of government we have. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I was struck when I had the Christopher Wray in front of the Judiciary Committee yesterday, and we were kind of going back and forth. And you saw Jerry Nadler. He's the ranking member for your viewers out there. Jerry Nadler started the interview by talking about this whole threat to democracy stuff. You're like, what happened to turning the temperature down? I mean, what happened to what was actually going on with someone going and targeting President Trump and trying to assassinate him 2 weeks ago? And I think that's what you're seeing here. And I went through and I found a whole bunch of quotes, and I don't have them right in front of me, but we had members of that very committee, Jerry Nadler himself, Kamala Jayapal, who had referred to him as a fascist. You had people referred to him as Hitler. You have people referring to him as, all sorts of horrible phrases, including a threat to democracy. That's exactly who they are. That's exactly what they're doing. And they don't really care about that post-assassination attempt. And they want to actually turn it on President Trump. They say, well, he's to blame. They're the ones that have been ratcheting up the heat on this. But at the end of the day, you know what the American people care about? They care about the fact they can't afford things. They care about the fact there's criminals on their streets. They care about the fact their borders are open. They care about the fact they've been put in endless wars and all of the issues they want to see fixed. And frankly, they want to go back to the way things were in 2020, 2019 before President Biden.
You led the charge to evoke the 25th Amendment. Donald Trump has now come out saying that he is not in favor of doing that because Kamala is real garbage and worse than she is. Do you still stand by it? Do you still want to see the 25th Amendment here?
Well, first of all, Congress cannot invoke the 25th Amendment, right? Only the vice president and the cabinet can. I filed that resolution on the Friday after the debate to make very clear that it was my position, and I believe the position of the vast majority of the members of Congress and any observers and the American people, that Joe Biden is not fit to be the commander-in-chief and to carry out the powers and the duties of the office. And the 25th Amendment says that it is up to the vice president and the cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment. And it is clear to everybody that, of course, it should be invoked. And I think President Trump knows this, but But President Trump is a smart politician, and he knows that Kamala Harris is the target right now. And he's pointing out that having Kamala Harris in the White House is hardly, reassuring for those of us who are looking at Joe Biden's mental deficiencies. Like Kamala Harris is someone that, you say, all right, well, maybe she's all there, but her judgment, her policy choices, her radical ideology, her inability to get anything done, her ridiculousness in going to Ukraine and trying to do something there, but then immediately you have Russia invade like days later, allegedly being put in charge of going down and dealing with the Northern Triangle in Mexico and dealing with the border, so-called border czar, and total failure there. President Trump is right. She'd be horrible in the Oval Office. But I have a job in Congress to call balls and strikes in a constitutional republic, and I don't think he's fit to be the commander-in-chief. That doesn't change anything. But the bottom line is Congress can't do anything about it. We'll see what they do. But do you think that Kamala Harris is going to invoke the 25th Amendment? No way. She's not going to do that. If they decide that she needs to be the incumbent, Joe Biden will resign.
Congressman, I think I've been a fan of talking about the 25th Amendment this entire time. I don't think the point needs to be hammered every single day that he's not fit to lead right now, given what we've seen. But let's back up a little bit, because in this insane week, do you have an interpretation of these events that Joe Biden himself did not explain last night? There was no explanation of what's happened, why he said what he did Sunday. What is your understanding of this chain of events that led us here?
Well, I think if you're talking broadly speaking about, where we are, I think it goes back to the fact that Democrats have been covering up the extent to which Joe Biden has been declining. Okay, that is, I think, really important for the American people to understand. Jill Biden, Hunter, the chief of staff, all of the staff around him, and importantly, the vice president of the United States, Kamala Harris herself, cabinet officials, Democrats in charge on Capitol Hill. They've all seen his cognitive decline. They know it. Hell, Christopher Wray, I think, lied under oath to continue to try to protect the fact that they've been observing his mental decline. They didn't want to admit it. You know why? Because they created a box for themselves. They had chosen a vice president who has no business being in the Oval Office of commander-in-chief. And they know it. They've seen it. They've seen her performance. They've seen her polling. So they didn't want to invoke the 25th, or they didn't want to have Joe Biden resign. He didn't want to step aside because he knew that she wasn't the best candidate, but they couldn't pass over her. So they've been in this box. But finally, at the end of the day, after the debate performance, I think that was all sort of a process for getting to the place where they're going to need to get, and that was to move on to Kamala Harris. And we'll see what happens with the Democrats between now and their convention. But, I don't think she's landing too well out there in the heartland.
Final question for you. We've been seeing this political dance between Obama and Kamala Harris. So what do you know about their relationship?
I might be the last person to be expressing any kind of intimate awareness or knowledge of the relationship between Barack Obama and Kamala Harris. What I can tell you is that Barack Obama sits back and he tries to look back and try to play the field. I think he and I think all of the people around Joe Biden for the last 3.5 years and currently viewed him as a, frankly, useful Manchurian candidate, a puppet that they could control. And I think they've been able to drive radical policies and radical ideologies, things that I think that Joe Biden of even 10 years ago or 20 years ago certainly wouldn't have been inclined to do. And so I think they've seen him as useful. And I think that was another factor in trying to keep him there at top of the ticket. If they could just, run another basement campaign and keep him in the office, oh, great, we'll have 4.5 more years to keep, doing what they were doing with their radical experiment with radical progressive Democrats in charge. So I think Barack Obama's been a part of that as well. But right now, though, they're just stuck with Kamala Harris, and they're going to have to go see where it goes.
Representative Chip Roy, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, y'all.
Israel's prime minister received a hostile welcome in D.C. Up next. During his congressional address yesterday, Benjamin Netanyahu made this somewhat controversial statement.
My friends, if you remember one thing from the speech, remember this. Our enemies are your enemies. Our fight is your fight, and our victory will be your victory.
Protesters tore down American flags in Washington, D.C. in response to Benjamin Netanyahu's congressional address, and they forced police to deploy pepper spray. Other protesters claimed in social media videos that they released maggots and other insects and pulled the fire alarm in the Israeli delegation's hotel. We're now joined by journalist and fellow at the Claremont Institute, Dave Reaboi. Dave, thanks so much for joining us. So if their anger is completely really addressed at Israel, then why are these protesters just angry at America as a whole?
Well, thanks for having me. I think the answer to that is that it's not. The left around the world and also in the United States has been enamored with the Palestinian cause for many, many decades now, and I think that there's a kind of good reason to that for that, and that's because the Palestinian cause is like the perfect distilled, most pure expression of revolutionary politics in the world today, possibly even ever. There is no unifying, there's no unifying plan. There is no civil society. There is no culture. There is no government. There is no infrastructure. There's nothing but revolutionary violence. And frankly, revolutionary violence justified by grievance. And if that sounds familiar, that sounds like a dream to leftists in this country and around the world. I think also, to be quite honest, and I'm not sure a lot of people have kind of had the guts to say this, but for a lot of people in BLM and Antifa and in some of these violent groups, they are jealous of the Palestinians. The Palestinians get to commit revolutionary violence all day long, kill as many Jews as possible, and the only answer that they get in Palestinian society is praise. And, there are no famous sports figures or doctors or, or politicians or poets or writers or filmmakers in the Palestinian society. The only heroes are martyrs and terrorists. So there's a bit of jealousy there, I think.
Dave, I want to talk about both the right and the left here. On the left, can you explain the role of this movement and where you think it stands right now? I mean, obviously, for a long time now, we've seen these protests at the college campuses and now in Washington, D.C. Is this going to continue? Is it on the rise? Is it going down? And how does it work in the left? Why is it there? What role does it play?
Well, it has the role of it's a cause, right? It's a cause, and for that reason, it's an organizing. It's an excuse to organize revolutionary sentiment. So we saw it in 2020 with BLM. We saw it prior to that in different types of things. You had Ferguson, you had what do you call it? Anti-capitalist riots and things like that. In elsewhere outside of the country, you've got a similar cast of characters rioting over really what have you, politics in Paris and in the UK and in other places. I think they see what's happening in Gaza as an excuse to mobilize. And frankly, it's a pretty good excuse to mobilize. I mean, if you're in the mobilization business, if you're in the, hey, let's make our side really angry business, then any types of events like this just serve to advance the cause. And the cause is always the same. It's the worldwide revolution.
Well, Dave, the last 3 weeks or so, we have seen so many crazy headlines in the news. And part of this is what we're referring to as well. Is there any historical context that you can place around this to say, no, it's not just happening right now. We've seen something like this before.
Well, I mean, the easy comparison is Germany in the 1930s. In as far as the sentiment towards Jews goes. I think it's completely apt to make that kind of comparison. Maybe not in terms of the kind of state sanctioned side, but definitely in terms of the sentiment out on the street. For the first time in living memory, you have you have Jews who are afraid to go out into the street because there's a good chance that if they are identifiable as Jews, they will be attacked in some of these blue cities where where far leftists and Islamists have had the run of the place for a while. So there's definitely a bit of that. We're coming up to a big, very important election, and I think that a lot of folks who follow Antifa will tell you that the Gaza protests were it was a warm up, and it's a warm up that still continues. But every once in a while, you have to excite the troops. Every once in a while, you have to remind people that there are things that that you need to get in the streets about, and I think that's how they see it.
Well, Dave, at some point we will have to have you back on and talk a little bit about the nuances of what's going on the right in foreign policy in Israel. I think there's a lot more there to discuss. But in the time we have left, I do not want to move on until you tell people why you knew that Biden was going to step down, because we have mutual friends to gloat on because you and I were correct. But say a little bit about that.
Sure. Yes, you and I were correct in analyzing this, and I think, I knew immediately when the New York Times editorial page came out with a unified voice. You had 15 different columnists who rarely agree on anything, or let's say rarely agree to write on the same topic on a single day, and they spoke with one voice, and they said, "Joe, you got to go." And it wasn't like, "Hey, Joe, maybe you better think about going, maybe reassess this." It was like, "Nope, out the door." And immediately, you saw that, I saw that, and it was a big sign about, it was a big sign of things to come. And I think we based that analysis on the fact that the New York Times editorial page, the best connected Democratic establishment media outlet in the world by far, decided to go whole hog into this. They must know something. And immediately I thought, well, they must be talking to Barack Obama. They must be talking to big donors. They must be talking to other power centers in the Democratic Party for them to go out on a limb like this. Because had they gone out on a limb and not been certain that the pressure on Biden will be increasing and frankly insurmountable, even if he did want to stay, they would have never done it, because it would have diminished their power. They would have looked like fools. So the strength and the self-confidence with which they stepped out and made that proclamation convinced me, and you as well, that this is a done deal. And then of course you look at the other kind of little data points, and the other big one for me was seeing the mountains of left-wing reporters coming out and saying, "Oh yeah, Biden looked like hell 2 years ago when I met him, and he didn't remember my name at this and this fundraiser and this time." And of course, you get angry. Your first impulse is to get angry and to think, where were these people? Why didn't they say anything? But then when you put that aside and you go deeper and you start to read the color surrounding these articles and the details of how this stuff went down, you see that in each of them, Jill Biden was completely fried. She was harried. She was sweating. She was nervous. She was always at Joe's side when he is about to do something silly. And, she's the one who's whispering, "Hey, this is, a big donor who you've known for 40 years," into his ear, because he doesn't know who he's talking to. I saw that and I thought, there's a limited lifespan on this. There are not very many people who who feel very confident about being in a situation, an ongoing situation with somebody who's in obvious mental and physical decline like this. They were looking for an exit ramp. And I think the wait was until they got, until they got enough donations to the Biden presidential library for it to, for it to all be okay. Because I wrote on Substack that Joe Biden was never more powerful in his life than he was in the last 3 weeks while they were trying to get him out. He could have asked for anything. He could have asked, to go to the moon or for a private island or whatever, and wealthy Democrat donors would have given it to him just to go away. So I think that's what happened.
Well, and Jill Biden is still going to get that Vogue cover that she so desperately wanted. Dave, we could talk to you all day. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We'll go to Chris Bedford in D.C. to cover the aftermath there next. Yesterday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke at length about his country's war with Hamas, but he made sure to give a shout out to a certain presidential nominee.
I want to thank President Trump for his leadership in brokering the historic Abraham Accords. Like Americans, Israelis were relieved that President Trump emerged safe and sound from that dastardly attack on him, dastardly attack on American democracy. There is no room for political violence in democracies. I also want to thank President Trump for all the things he did for Israel, from recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, to confronting Iran's aggression, to recognizing Jerusalem as our capital and moving the American embassy there.
We're joined now by Christopher Bedford, the senior politics editor and Washington correspondent for Blaze Media. And Chris, today Netanyahu met with President Biden. What can you tell us about that meeting?
It was a surprisingly short meeting. Press was expecting a little bit more. And at first, this meeting was canceled when Joe Biden got sick. I guess they rescheduled it later on. But they were only in front of the press for about 90 seconds. And it was a very short introduction. Joe Biden gave a couple cursory remarks. Netanyahu thanked him for being a proud Irish-American Zionist, which is an interesting thing because he knows that Netanyahu knows that so much of Joe Biden's base, as he saw with the riots in D.C. that we were covering, is against Zionism very loudly. And this is kind of a political hot issue for Joe Biden. So he kind of he's obviously trying to hug the Democrats closer on this issue and say, hey, we're going to hold you to the 50 years of friendship that Joe Biden has personally in his political career shown to Israel, and the 40 years that the two have personally known each other. And then a slightly interesting thing that happened after that is as Joe Biden was going in to meet privately with the prime minister before they met with hostages, some reporters yelled at him, Reagan Reese from the Daily Caller, did you step down because of your health? And he looked at her and he shook his head no. So maybe this is just part of the whole line that they're pushing, that no, this was just a passing the torch on sort of thing, and we're totally capable of running the country still. But the plot thickens every single day.
Chris, I don't know if you've seen this picture that people were circulating today of him, next to Bibi, just staring off into space. But it's worth it's worth a lot of money, I tell you that. Unbelievable stuff. What do we make of the irony here that it wasn't so long ago that the Biden administration wanted Netanyahu to step down, and now all of a sudden, look who is stepping down. And so you have to think that the prime minister is having a lot of fun today in a way. I mean, and also, what is there to talk about? He's a lame duck president. I mean, he just lost all his power last night.
What all they have to talk about right now is whether is Joe Biden's executive order to hold up some of the arms shipments to Israel, some of the munitions that they say they could use, in which Netanyahu said in his fourth speech to a joint session of Congress that he needs them to finish the job. Now, Netanyahu is one of the shrewdest and most capable politicians on the planet right now. He's the longest-serving prime minister Israel's ever seen. He has gotten involved in American politics in a way that was considered completely wrong-headed previously for previous prime ministers. He's more conservative than a lot of them are. And because of that, he's certainly burned some bridges. Barack Obama and him had a pretty cold relationship. He was much closer with Donald Trump and seemed even supportive of Trump running for victory. Trump's victory. Well, Obama sent aides to help unseat his party in Israel. Of course, he didn't officially send the aides, but a lot of his top people somehow ended up working for the opposition. So there's been this real cold détente between them. And for Netanyahu to come over here, get the invitation from Congress, get it sealed out of a custom and manners by the Democrat counterparts in the House and the Senate, and it just put the Democrats in such a bind at a period of time when they really don't want to be talking about this issue. They want to talk about anything but that with their base in the lead up to November.
Along with Bibi, the graffiti and vandalism came to Washington, D.C. yesterday. Where did you see some of the worst of the worst?
It was awful. When I went down to Union Station this morning, went down, there was supposed to be a couple, I got word late at night that a couple hundred Republican staff were going to be heading down there to lead cleanup efforts if the National Park Service hadn't gotten there. Unfortunately, those staff were disappointed because the National Park Service had gotten there. They'd been working all night. And there you can see in that video the graffiti that said Hamas is coming. That was spray painted on the National Columbus Memorial, which is an historic marker, an historic example of classical classical sculpture, and something that used to welcome people in this country to the nation's capital, right there next to Union Station. And people weren't allowed to help because the Park Service there is using some pretty serious solvents and different chemicals to take that out. It's the kind of thing that causes real damage. And if you looked at the Liberty Bell replica there, or if you looked at the bricks where the flag was burned, the Park Service was having to torch the bricks and scrape up the remnants. What you see is a bunch of hardworking D.C. city employees, most of them black, cleaning up after a bunch of rich white kids who came in here dressed as Palestinian terrorists and vandalized American memorials, and then they went home to their parents' houses or wherever they're spending their summer vacation. Well, real actual working people who they claim to represent had to clean it up. And you wonder, who did they convince with this disgusting show, with these attacks on police officers, by dragging officers around by their body armor and overwhelming the extremely undermanned Park Service who was there, who didn't get the backup that they requested from other agencies? You're wondering who they convinced with this show, but it wasn't really about convincing American people. It was supposed to be a show of force, a show of violence to the Democrat Party and to the American people, that if they don't get what they want, they'll hurt you.
Chris, I mean, I love the way you say that. It's really like a kind of choreographed dance or a live action role play, the way in which this plays out. And it really is ridiculous. We have to talk about the speech last night. I mean, my takeaway was very simple. Number one, 2 points. Number one, he doesn't mention the obvious. He doesn't explain what needs to be explained, which is why he's stepping down, maddening. And then number two is he just doubled down on this divisive, dangerous rhetoric. But we talked about this a little last night. Give us your takeaway.
Well, right away you could tell that insufferable historian John Meacham had written it, because it had all of his dumb cliches. The guy's a bad pop writer who's gotten way too much credit for too long, and it's really been finally exposed by the fifth Biden speech where he plagiarized himself. And then you've got all the darkness you're talking about, you just mentioned. This is the end of democracy, and nothing will stand in the way of Democrats winning this election. Of course, we've seen it. I mean, we've seen shots fired at their opponent. We've seen an unending lawfare. We've seen Joe Biden taken out and replaced with Kamala Harris. We've seen the biggest round of political donations over 2 days in world history. So he's got a point when he says that nothing will stand in between us and actual victory here. And lastly, well, as you just mentioned, everyone in D.C. seems to be completely satisfied that Joe Biden's stepping aside because they just need to win and Kamala Harris is going to do it. The actual American people who didn't get a say in this, who didn't have a vote, who had no primary elections, who've been lied to for 4 years or longer, are sitting there wondering, well, when is your speech going to happen that explains why you're stepping down and what's happened? And they got none of that last night.
We'll just call it historic, Chris. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be here.
FBI whistleblower Steve Friend joins us to weigh in on the Bureau's Trump assassination attempt probe. Don't go anywhere. Christopher Wray's congressional testimony was filled with speculation on everything from Biden's cognitive health to whether or not a bullet actually pierced Donald Trump's ear. But the most pervasive question continues to be, how did a 20-year-old manage to slip past the Secret Service's radar?
Is there any evidence at all that he may have been in contact with somebody else before this occurred that may have had any prior knowledge or may have helped him plan this event?
Well, needless to say, that is a question that we're intensely focused on, because that would obviously be incredibly meaningful. So far, underline, so far, we have not found any evidence of any accomplices or co-conspirators, foreign or domestic.
And you're using geolocation data to see if his cell phone was near another cell phone, I presume?
Right, we're doing lots of different kinds of cellular analysis, geolocation stuff, looking at his accounts. He, from everything we've seen, which is consistent with what we've learned in interviews, a lot of people describe him as a loner. That does kind of fit with what we're seeing in his devices. His list of contacts, for example, is very short, compared to what you would normally see from most people.
To help us break it all down, we have Steve Baker, Blaze Media investigative reporter, and Steve Friend, senior fellow for the Center for Renewing America and FBI whistleblower. Steve Friend, let's start with you. From your previous experience, how transparent do you think the FBI will be for this public investigation?
Well, I think that we have a proof of concept. The FBI loves to hide behind, we can't reveal sources and methods. It's an ongoing investigation. We're just going to drag this out as long as we possibly can until people either lose interest or there's something else that we can get our hooks into that's going to do better for us in the headlines. The FBI has a track record of even investigating assassination attempts pretty poorly. You look to the Capitol baseball shooting that happened in, I believe, 2017, where Steve Scalise was shot, and the shooter there was a Bernie Sanders supporter, showed up in the parking lot, asked where the Republicans were. Well, the FBI ruled that a suicide by cop, not an assassination attempt. So I don't have any confidence in them to actually carry forward an honest and forthright investigation of any kind, because they've demonstrated themselves to be just a politically partisan organization, particularly as it pertains to Donald Trump at this point.
Steve, there was a lot of fascination with Director Wray's testimony yesterday. For one thing, he appeared to be more forthright than he's been in any previous congressional hearings. Did you get that impression, or do you see something else that was going on there that maybe wasn't quite what everybody's reading into this?
Well, he wasn't quite on the X like he's typically, where there's a lot of outrage from the members about the conduct of the FBI. I think there's a lot of attention really being thrown at the Secret Service at this point. I think he, at that point, gave a little bit of an exhale, felt like there was a little bit of a hold my beer from the Secret Service, and he could give a little bit more here. The expectations here, because of the facts and circumstances, there's a great demand for them. He's going to be willing to give a little bit here. But by and large, Christopher Wray has just done the exact same thing all the time. And I think it's derivative of, one, he's a politically partisan guy, but secondly, he's not an outcomes guy. Like the folks on this panel, the American people, were outcome driven. We want to see results. We want to see an effective investigation actually transpire where we get all the answers. He doesn't see that as success. He's about the process. Process itself is success. He's going to come up there and say, look, we have all these tools that you gave us and we're using them all. Look at all the resources we brought to bear. You gave us $12 billion. Why don't you give us $13 billion next year?
You touched on it a little bit right there, but how do you describe Christopher Wray?
Well, I think that one thing you have to know about Christopher Wray is that he made $9.2 million a year before he was brought in as the FBI director. And he gave that up for a $200,000 a year job for a 10-year appointment where he'd have to live apart from his family. I've always sort of associated that with, that's a 10-year appointment, $9 million sacrifice annually, $90 million. That's what his sacrifice was for the cause. And the cause was bringing cultural Marxism to its full fruition within the FBI. You can see it in the hiring standards has been exposed by the Judiciary Committee, and then Miranda Devine reported on the New York Post. and other folks that I have anecdotally who have communicated with me their concerns, where they're bringing in people at this point who are 50 pounds overweight, describing themselves as woke. And then most recently, you had somebody hired by the Washington field office who is an actual heroin addict, because they're just willing to follow orders. They know that being an FBI agent is something that they can get paid really well, they can have all the esteem, and they just have to do what they're told. And Christopher Wray has overseen that wokeification that we've seen. It's described to us over the last few years particularly.
Steve, by the way, love Rust Vote and the Center and the work you guys are doing. It's great stuff. People should check that out. My question is very simple. How do we get out of this? I mean, it doesn't seem to me from what you're saying, and I agree with much of it, that there's much we can hope for when it comes to getting down to the truth of this in the FBI. I mean, do you think this is a lost cause at this point?
Well, the agency itself, I think, is a lost cause because the reforms that are necessary to bring it back from the brink are so drastic that you can do a complete reboot or the massive reform, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. There's major reforms that need to be institutionally given out there. They need to drastically reduce its footprint from a headquarters standpoint. 1 in 5 people who work for the FBI work in Washington, D.C. They need to get rid of the intelligence branch entirely, get back to actually doing criminal investigations, do not concern themselves with intelligence gathering on the American people. But I think, honestly, the best thing that we could do for the FBI to make it an effective and objective force for good would be to take the guns away, remove the teeth from the attack dog. The origin of the FBI was an unarmed investigative agency. It can return to that, and it can do what Christopher Wray says that it is always intending to do, and that is aid local law enforcement, aid the local sheriffs, the police chiefs in the cases that they need to address for their communities and their constituencies, who they are most responsive to.
Steve, you posted on X that little birdies were telling you that there's more concern about right-wing violence as a response to Donald Trump's assassination attempt than the attack itself within the IC community. And that's something that Congress should probably look into, you wrote. Can you expand on that a little?
Well, the mission creep that has set in since 9/11, when the FBI received its national security responsibilities to be the sentry on the wall, and the mission creep that set in now, we've evolved from homegrown violent extremism who were Muslim Americans to domestic violent extremists who were moms going to school board meetings and people flying the Gadsden or the Betsy Ross flag outside their house. And now we have the latest iteration, which is called the anti-government, anti-authority violent extremist, AGAVE. And the FBI and Department of Homeland Security have actually authored a strategic assessment describing what an agave is. And that is a profile of someone who has a perception of government overreach or negligence. That is all. The playbook remains the same. The FBI identifies a vulnerable person and they entrap them. They groom them, they use undercovers, they use informants, and they get them to do something that they do not have the proclivity, the means, or the opportunity to even do. Just get them to agree to do it, and then they come swooping in. Because the FBI is a bureaucracy. They're driven by growing their budgets, expanding their programs, expanding their power. The victim of their entrapments has changed. It's gone from the Muslim American to now the right-wing extremists because there are political reasons for that. But they are all too happy to turn their guns on whoever they're directed to, and that's been the most recent iteration that we've seen under the national security banner.
Director Wray was clearly disingenuous about an early answer yesterday in this hearing. When he was asked about whether the hiring standards had been lowered for new incoming agents, can you speak to that?
Well, that's been recently revealed by the House Judiciary Committee. They actually did a report on this. The fact is that they've reduced the fitness standards. When I went through in 2014, we had to pass the fitness test before we even arrived to Quantico to do the new agent training. That's no longer the case. You just have to pass it by the end of the training there. So they're allowing people to arrive. They're investing quite a bit of money in them to bring them to the field. And if they're not able to do that, they're going to be more inclined to maybe hit the little timer on the 300-meter sprint a little bit later to ensure that they get the time to pass muster. And a lot of the hiring that's gone on, they're trying to hit their diversity quotas. Here's another thing. The FBI has 9 diversity advisory committees that report directly to the FBI director. They're all in on the DEI. They're all in on the 30 by 30 initiative that's ensuring 30% women in policing by the year 2030. And that's going to fundamentally change the culture of law enforcement.
Steve, given what you're saying, how are we going to get to the bottom of what actually happened on that fateful Saturday and this assassination attempt?
Well, I would encourage Congress, the House, which is controlled by the Republicans, to use this as a wedge issue in the upcoming budget fight. They need to authorize an independent, parallel investigation and assure that it's going to be fully transparent. This shooter has no expectation of privacy. The nature of this crime that has affected the lives of every single American necessitates that a full and transparent investigation happens where we have daily briefings of what goes on. I do not trust anyone who works for the FBI to carry forward a full and effective investigation. There are other people out there, effective investigators, experienced investigators, people who didn't just go to 16 weeks of training at Quantico who can carry this forward. I would trust them. I would even trust the Pennsylvania State Police to get involved at this point. There needs to be a parallel investigation to push the FBI to match their ability against someone else. And I think when that comes to pass, we're going to see that the FBI comes up short.
Steve Friend and Steve Baker, thanks so much for joining us today. That was just incredible. All right. You may already be driving in a futuristic dystopia. We'll explain how science fiction became a reality when we come back. For years, every American has been subject to ad campaigns for electric vehicles as eco-friendly alternatives to our gas-guzzling, climate change-inducing automobiles. However, that push is starting to fizzle out due to lack of demand from customers. But could this help China? For analysis on this issue, we are now joined by automotive expert Lauren Fick. So, Lauren, tell us, are electric vehicles on their way out for good?
Well, I don't know about for good. I think it's going to be a part of the mix, but I will tell you, it looks like all these mandates are not going to work. And you can tell by every single manufacturer, including today, we're seeing General Motors saying, you know, this is not working as planned. We're going to do what they were GM is calling it a coexist, where they're going to offer gasoline powered vehicles and electric vehicles after they were all ready to say, we're all in. They met with the White House. They were 100% in. And now they're changing their mind. And even today, Volvo said, and they were the ones that was definitely holding their ground, yeah, this is not going to go as planned. We're going to offer hybrids because they seem to be what consumers want. Yes, we don't want to be told what to buy.
Lauren, what's the average cost right now of an electric vehicle, and are these worth buying? I mean, everyone has thought about it.
Right. They're about $66,000 on average, where the average cost of a gasoline-powered car is somewhere around $49,000. Yes, you can buy lesser cost ones and more expensive ones. But when you average out the price and you start looking at the cost of the insurance, and then the charging stations and where to charge, and then, of course, the tires, which no one talks about because they wear out quicker because these vehicles are heavier. Those are all expenses that consumers start to find out about, and it's very difficult to get rid of a vehicle, especially if you leased one.
Well, is it worth the price tag then? You say that, okay, it's a little bit more expensive, but is it going to be worth it?
Well, that's a really good question. I think a lot of people think they're going to buy something and they're saving the planet. From that perspective, they're not. From what we call in our business cradle to grave, where you get the raw materials for the batteries, all the components and pieces and parts. In reality, it's worse for the environment, and no one talks about where the materials are mined for these batteries and who owns them all. It's China. No one talks about that either. But as far as buying an electric car, if you want one, you should be able to buy one. There's some great choices out there. Personally, I like the Hyundais and the Kias and the Genesis lineup because they give you the longer warranty and they have the faster charging, which is what they call 800-volt architecture. You don't get that with most of them. They're 400-volt. Tesla is an exception, has its own charging infrastructure, which is now being opened up to other brands. But it's really important to note that if you need it for like running around town, maybe it's your third car or your second car, you should be able to buy one. There's some great options. Where it's not a great option is where it's your only vehicle, because people that have done that thinking this is the answer, they're not very happy about that.
There's some freaky tech advancements, and you write about AI spies in cars. I don't want to know, but I'm going to ask you what it is.
Okay, there's a lot of things going on right now. Now, that particular article, which is on the Blaze, is cameras that are actually, I saw it myself. I was in England just a few weeks ago for Goodwood Festival of Speed. And as I was driving around London, you could see there were cameras like the ones you were showing on poles all over the place. And what they do is they check not just your speed, not just if you ran a red light, but also, do you have a phone on your lap? Are you on your phone? Are you wearing your seatbelt? Are you talking? Are you distracted? And if so, a computer will generate a decision saying, you know what? I think you're distracted and you're not paying attention. Then they'll then go to the police officer. There's 2 cameras on each pole, as you can see. One is for the car and one is for the driver, and they actually zoom in on the driver. So no privacy here because they're tracking all this information. Now, if you think it's happening in the UK, it's not going to happen here. Well, that infrastructure bill that passed in 2021, the one that has the kill switch bill in it, Section 24220 is the kill switch. Well, there's also $15.6 billion of your tax dollars going to spy on you because we're going to have these cameras in place all over the country. And the only way to get away from it is the money's going to the states. It's then going to the counties and the cities. So you can contact your county elected officials and say, you know what, you want to get reelected? We don't want these cameras. And the more people that say something, the better chance that it won't happen. But remember, they're sharing the fees for the tickets. So they kind of want it. So it's all about control. I know they're listening on your car. I know that they're tracking in your car, but this is even more intrusive.
Lauren, I can't wait to get off the grid. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Me too. Thank you.
Matthew, what's left for us to do? How do we get around all this?
I mean, I don't like it. Forget electric and anything. I don't like a car that has screens. I want a wheel that I can drive. That's how much of a, I guess, boomer I am. But now we think about the screens watching us. It never ends, and that's not the end of it. I mean, they can turn off your car.
It's in the water at the Blaze. You and Glenn Beck just want the oldest cars that you can find that have no computers hooked up to them. And you know what? You might be the smart ones in the end.
What's retro is cool again.
It is. You know what? Make sure to subscribe to Blaze News Tonight on your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps others to find this as well. And who knows? The week we've had with all this news, we're going to be back with some excellent stories for you tomorrow.